In this case, it's contributions, votes, and support. I do think the United States has like a really significant crypto and Bitcoin. I don't know how that will translate to actual votes, but I think politicians believe that this will have a lot of impact on our voting line. So you see Trump coming up against CBDCs, and so that's become kind of like a party line issue now.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for joining the show. Can you introduce yourself briefly to our audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. So my name is Roger. I've been writing about Bitcoin since 2014. I started writing about it with TechCrunch and VentureBeat. Now currently write for Forbes, and I've written a book of Bitcoin in China with Bitcoin Magazine called Would Mao Hold Bitcoin?
Okay, so a lot of things around Bitcoin. Can you share with us how you discovered it, like your whole Bitcoin story that led you to writing and being an author on this topic?
Yeah, it's funny. I first got attracted to the people within the early Bitcoiners. I was trying to understand like kind of what made them tick. So I was in the Montreal tech scene, and then I met a couple of Bitcoiners back in the day. Blockstream, for example, was founded in Montreal. Not many people know that. And the Bitcoin Embassy was created there as well. So I started getting curious about that, started to launch into it. I learned by writing. So I started writing about the topic, and then that's kind of grown this fascination that's continued throughout the years.
Okay, and you tend to focus in your book on with Mao hold Bitcoin. What was the idea behind the book, and what did you delve into it?
Yeah. Well, first, people ask me a lot about the title. They usually ask me like, what is your opinion on that? To be honest with you, like one of the reasons why we chose the title is because China seems like a very mysterious topic. And if there's something that everybody seems to know about China, it's at least Mao Zedong. My personal opinion is it shows China's contrasts. Mao the rebel, who was hiding out in the caves, may well have held Bitcoin, but of course, Mao the communist, when he was in power, probably would not. So, just to think about, all the stages of evolution that China went through, just within Mao's reign. But the book itself actually starts in the 1980s. I think that's one thing that people don't understand as much is China's economic rise post Mao's death. I think it's actually one of the most relevant stories in the world, especially for investors, I think, but also one of the most underappreciated. Like how you think China grew economically from its roots in the 1980s matters a lot to how you would think about the world and how you think about structuring the world. And it might surprise people, but that was one of the reasons why I actually started writing the book was because Chinese people are very, very, very curious about Bitcoin. They were some of the first founders of mining companies, exchanges, some of the biggest Bitcoin businesses you can name all pretty much started in China. And there's a reason for that. It's because China and the Chinese people out of all countries is uniquely positioned to understand the qualities that Bitcoin has. And it starts all the way in the 1980s with how Deng Xiaoping and China kind of switched from this socialist based uh, economy to a more like socially based market economy, socialism, the Chinese characteristics the leadership called it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic actually, because in the Bitcoin space, what China is most known for is banning Bitcoin, or being one of the biggest economies banning Bitcoin. But when you think about it, there's a very strong capital control on all currencies, not only digital currencies, that are enforced in China. So it's kind of part of the strength and the weakness of the Chinese business model to be able to operate under capital control to protect its economy, and then at the same time give a competitive edge to Chinese manufacturers to sell their product abroad. I think that's the logic, no?
Yeah, I mean, the capital controls play a number of different roles. One of the things I dived into the book is, first we can talk about a little bit the capital controls vis-a-vis Bitcoin. There definitely are people who suggest that uh, Chinese people are using Bitcoin to evade those capital controls. The marquee capital control. So, a few things just to talk about what you just said. China is the country that has been ranked the most restrictive in terms of capital controls in the world several times by many studies. Um, the marquee capital control, the one I think that most people will understand and know easily, is administered by this the SAFE agency, basically uh, the foreign exchange agency in China. And what it says is that unless you are under certain circumstances, like for example, you're traveling or you've requested a manual exemption, you're not allowed to bring more than $50,000 USD per person per year outside of the country, right? And
Yeah,
so,
so I want to delve into this topic maybe before going to Bitcoin, like from an economics perspective.
yeah,
Obviously, it has been there for a while, and the Chinese economy has grown significantly under this capital control.
yeah.
What is the economic theory behind it, and how sustainable outside of Bitcoin is it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is to control capital within Chinese borders, right? Because the whole like China's been running a capital account surplus the entire time, right? And so you don't want people flowing capital outside of China for control reasons. You want that to circulate domestically, internally, within the banks, the banking, commercial banking system, and the kind of Chinese economy writ large. I mean, one of the implications of the capital controls, and one of the reasons why I think Chinese people now, especially now, are very sensitive to Bitcoin, is that they can only really invest large amounts of money into Chinese equities or into Chinese real estate. And most will choose Chinese real estate, actually. The largest sector will choose that. And so this has a lot of fascinating implications. One, to give you like a really quick one, just off the cuff, one is that China's local governments raise their taxation mostly through property sales. And so there needs to be real estate appreciation for local governments to have significant revenue. They also have like value added tax and a few other things. But in 1994, the premier at the time, Zurunji, basically decentralized a lot of the tax system, well, actually re-centralized, I should say, because the federal government ended up collecting a lot more of the income tax than the local government. And this has created an immense amount of income inequality in China because there have been seizures of rural land plots and things related to that. Um, and so when you're looking at this kind of like local tax model, for example, this is like a significant, potentially significant cause of income inequality that increased between the years of 1990 towards 2010. It's right now it's leveling off a little bit, but China was and continues to be actually one of the most unequal if you measure it from a Gini coefficient standpoint. So the capital controls have all kinds of these interesting consequences. We can talk a little bit about the link to Bitcoin. I mean, I think personally it means that there is a Chinese investor class now that is very much asking the question of, well, I can't get return on Chinese real estate. It's been going down, weighted against any number of different things, especially in the tier A cities, tier one cities like Shenzhen. Prices have gone down somewhere between 25-30% if you denominate it by gold, for example. So now you're looking around and you're like, well, they're investing in bonds because those are the only thing that can really have return. We know that Chinese people still purchase and demand Bitcoin and Tether in fairly significant quantities. 2023, when Chain Analysis checked, I think there were like 972 something bill 900. I'm not giving you exact numbers because I'm trying to quote from memory, but like 900 billion or so of transactions related in China. There's been significant interest in all kinds of investable quantities in Bitcoin, including ordinals, BRC20 runes, which trade exclusively on tether pairs. A lot of the traditional Chinese kind of exchanges, so Huobi, OKX, as well as Binance, they're not allowed to trade from Yuan for Bitcoin, but now they trade Tether for Bitcoin. And some significant portion of that, I think Huobi CEO said that a few months after the ban, that they got half their traffic from non-China sources. But of course, that means that half of their traffic was still coming from China. So there's a strong and enduring demand. And I believe with China's economy now, the capital controls are kind of a double-edged sword. They've created this like reservoir of pent-up capital in China that is now, it's kind of almost a reverse. Back in the 2000s, you were looking at search for yield from an American perspective. Right now, I think the Chinese retail investor class is looking for yield, and they've been denied for it. By the way, most people have said like, okay, well, what about the Hong Kong spot Bitcoin ETFs? Like, what's going on with that, right? But in fact, mainland investors, even though they have a facility called the Southern China Exchange to be able to invest into Hong Kong equities, they are actually not allowed specifically to invest into the Bitcoin spot ETFs or any Bitcoin related products for that matter. So there's all this like pent up demand that's been kind of artificially regulated. I do think that's a double edged sword at this point. It's definitely helped maintain China's capital account surplus, allowed them to sell without having immense amounts of Dutch disease, I guess you could say, is the monetary economics term. But you have to understand that now there are tons of people trying to escape this system. And it has like all kinds of underappreciated implications for, Chinese, for the world economy, frankly. I mean, China is the second largest economy, and the way Chinese people consume, some of it, at least at the higher tiers of income, is very specific to the capital restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, from a Chinese regulator perspective, uh, Bitcoin is a potential threat to the existing capital control because it's an escape vessel. So it was natural as soon as volume and activity picked up in mainland China to have this ban coming in place. But then what we have seen is we have seen a pickup of Bitcoin mining in China, and after the ban, it dropped a lot, and the difficulty dropped a lot because all the Chinese miners had to shut down operations. But now it's picking up again. So we're in a kind of weird situation today where buying Bitcoin with your Yuan is forbidden, but buying Bitcoin mining machines that produce Bitcoin seems to be allowed, or at least not forbidden explicitly or tolerated. I don't know what's the right term. How do you think it's going to evolve on the long run?
Yeah, I mean, mining, very fascinating topic on China. A lot of the, Bitmain, obviously, a lot of the companies that manufacture the first generation of ASICs, application specific, those integration circuits, the ones that are uh, only usable, the only usable kind of ways to mine Bitcoin these days with how high the difficulty is, right? You need to create custom computers. Um, One of the parts of my book really dived into, the early generation of people, why it was the case that China, because it had that hardware advantage, was able to spawn so many different companies. And what you realize is that all of the different layers move together because all the miners were spawned kind of in China, because that's where the mining hardware was. there started to begin all these mining pools. But then also your next natural question as a miner is like, well, if I'm mining Bitcoin, right, some of the miners are going to want to sell that Bitcoin. And so that is some of the beginnings of the first, Bitcoin exchanges, BTCC and other places. They really started because Chinese investors wanted to buy Bitcoin with Yuan, and Mt. Gox didn't sell Bitcoin for Yuan right at the time. Um, and but a lot of the exchanges then grew with the mining pools because the idea was like, if you're providing services to the miners, for example, Binance came out with a pool. There's F2 pool, there's AMP pool, all the pools that we know and that are still around today. One thing I would say is that the Bitcoin mining situation is a little bit nuanced in China. I think that the way I would currently characterize it is that in China, uh, there have been people have sent me photos. Like there are people in Shenzhen who are like openly selling ASIC miners, for example. They even have like on their storefront, it says like ASIC miner store. So anybody who kind of knows anything about Bitcoin will immediately know that they're selling ASIC miners. Now, having said that, Bitcoin mining is technically illegal in China. Now, the technically part is important. It is also illegal to trade Bitcoin and Tether. I did an analysis, and there have been more than 1,200 people arrested in China for doing that. Having said that, I think the nuance is a little bit the enforcement of it. How do you actually enforce? I think based off of uh, what's going on and the arrests that are actually happening, I do believe the mining ban. So what happened with the mining ban is the provinces were very, very happy to have miners operate. They were very, very happy because some of the provinces, Sichuan and a couple of others, they have a lot of stranded resources. Actually, Mao
Mm.
is partially responsible for some of that, Sichuan, because he was very big on the whole industrial policy of developing like different infrastructure, including hydroelectricity dams. But one of the issues with power in that way, in that grid, is like you can't build to stranded resources. I mean, China actually tried, which is kind of funny. Like, there was this whole idea of like ghost cities, right? But like
Mm.
in general, that power is kind of generated in an area, and it's very hard to move it around. So, or it's quite expensive to move it around to demand. And so, Bitcoin miners are perfect for that. You go in, you just set up shop and you take up as much power as possible. Obviously, stranded resources are cheap or cheaper. But for the local governments, the way they look at it is like, well, this is something I couldn't have used before, anyways. Like this dam was not generating any money for me. It was not generating any tax revenue. It was not generating jobs. But now with miners, you actually can get those jobs. But in 2021, what happened was the state council, and specifically Liu He, who is the senior economic advisor to Xi Jinping, I believe the person that Xi listens to among the most, if not the most, in economic matters, right? He basically wrote this statement that said, Bitcoin mining is like harmful to Chinese society is essentially the way I would summarize it. And so when the way it works kind of is like China, the provinces, they can get away with doing a whole bunch of things if the the top, the state council, which administers China, roughly speaking. I mean, they're not democratic institutions, so I'm not trying to compare apples to oranges here. But for metaphor, you can think of the state council as kind of like the European Commission, right? And then you can think of potentially, I would say, like the provincial governments is like each member state, right? And each member state will have its own interests, but perhaps a stronger version of the European Commission, I would say, steps into an issue, and then each member state has to at least pretend to like ladder up to that, right? So that's kind of what happened in the Chinese case. I might be butchering my European politics, but that's kind of like my metaphor that I use. And
No, it's a good metaphor actually because
yeah,
although they consider themselves very different in terms of policies and economics, they tend to agree on one very important topic, which is digital currencies. And you have
Yeah,
today in China the digital yuan, and the European Union is on its path to release a digital euro, whereas in the
yeah.
US there's a lot of resistance towards a CBDC. So the fact that you raise these similarities basically is kind of confirms a very similar organization, or at least politics, that are behind all these digital currencies.
Yeah, and I could talk a little bit about that. Let me just tie off the you asked me like Bitcoin mining ban, exchanges ban, where's it going to go? I mean, I think there's been a lot of clickbaity headlines. David Bailey wrote that like there's a Chinese study group on Bitcoin. I do think the Chinese government is thinking about or reevaluating some aspects of the ban. I don't think it's going to be reset anytime soon. The reason why is because, we mentioned Liu He, who was that senior economic advisor. Again, it would take Xi Jinping at this point to change his mind personally on the topic, of which I don't know that he is like the most informed per se. But like one thing I will say is that it's a little bit more nuanced than people could understand it. I mean, for example, obviously you have the Hong Kong Bitcoin spot ETFs that was released. That definitely probably was something that met the radar of like needing some approval from the central authorities, right? So in Hong Kong right now, you have the situation where there's one country, two systems they call it, but obviously with recent events, and I've done a lot of writing about the Hong Kong protests actually, so we can talk about that as well. But basically, now the sphere of politics has collapsed to a point where the central government in China is able to command a lot of different issues. They normally let Hong Kong do a lot of specific things. The SFC, for example, which is the SEC equivalent in Hong Kong, the HKMA, they let Hong Kong, I think, run those technocratic issues a little bit more widely than they let the city maybe run like other issues. But for example, the digital yuan was just integrated with Hong Kong, right? So I think it's very clear that the central authorities are watching what Hong Kong does with the spot Bitcoin ETFs and things like that. There was a professor in Hong Kong that said that like it was a mistake for China to ban Bitcoin mining because it led to a ton of tax revenue going to the United States again. So this is again my point with the provinces. The provinces are very happy to get you know on like they to get
Revenues.
basically tax revenue from these sources. Remember, in China, the name of the game is poverty elevation, is what Xi Jinping calls it. It's a central part, and a lot of these poorer provinces, can only accomplish those goals by raising local tax revenue from resources that aren't being useful. I think China's government is trying to push AI centers, AI data governance, because they don't believe that to be a threat
Mm.
like Bitcoin is into those areas. But regardless, like I think that China right now is at this kind of interesting point where they have all these broad laws, but they've asked local police enforcement to like kind of enforce it. And so I don't think there's a systematic way for you to track. I mean, there is, and there are countries that have deployed that. I don't think, based off of the arrests, that China's doing that with miners. But just give you an example, like Bitmain and a couple of the other companies, they no longer host their mining conferences in China. So I think it's kind of this thing where like if you mine individually and you're quiet about it, you know, there's
You
potential
get
that
away
you
with it.
will pass under the radar, but you shouldn't be very public about it because technically from a federal level it's still like illegal. Same thing with trading. A lot of the people who get arrested, they get arrested because they're putting a lot of huge yuan amounts into local bank accounts, and because they might be associated with like other crimes as well. There have been arrests for like relatively small buys of Tether, for example, like 10,000 USD. People have gone to 9 months to 13 months in jail or so. So I don't want to like discount that, but it's like imagine if you ask like the LAPD or like the NYPD or I don't even know even Europol or something to like enforce like hey we don't want people to be like trading Bitcoin or transacting with it, right? Like it's like very difficult to enforce that, and that's kind of part of the point of Bitcoin. It's like you can have decentralized hash, you can have decentralized, value transmission, because it's very hard to kind of control access to private keys and to have access to like individual machines, right? So the Bitcoin network can be resilient despite that. But yeah.
Okay, interesting. And what about the digital yuan and digital euro parallel? How do you see the politics and the similarities and the differences? Like here in Europe, we're fearing that we're going towards a authoritarian regime, maybe not with the same constraints on liberties, but maybe in Europe it's more going to be about climate change issues and your carbon footprint and social unrest and stuff like that. How do you see it evolving, these two economies and the digital CBDCs that are issuing?
Yeah, no, for sure. Really topical. I get asked a lot, actually specifically from Europeans. So I might actually come speak in Europe about the digital yuan. There's been a lot of curiosity about it. I think right now, really quick primer on the digital yuan, just for people who aren't as familiar. Digital yuan, China's version of a central bank digital currency, started research in 2014. They have a digital currency research institute in 2016, and it's been launched. Some people think, oh, China's still in pilot stage. It's in 29 cities. They accepted on the Beijing metro. It is like pretty much full scale implemented. They've tried to issue it so that foreigners can get access to it. So the system is pretty matured and has been responsible for at least $250 billion USD of transaction value, about 0.16% of China's monetary supply at that time. Small amounts, still, but still like showing that this is a product that has been launched, and pretty fully launched. So I do think the Europeans are going to be, along with, I mean, every country in the world, even rivals like India and Russia. Before we started this call, you asked a little bit about BRICS, right? Actually, well, Russia's not a rival to China, but India is a rival to China. And India is actually implementing its version of the digital rupee, and Russia is also implementing a version of CBDC. There's the HRF as a CBDC tracker, right, where it says, I believe, about 10 countries along with the Caribbean Union that launched the sand dollar, have all full scale launched. But there's something like almost the BIS, for example, the Central Bank for Central Banks. I believe a large majority of their members are considering or studying or piloting central bank digital currencies. And certainly the European Union will also be looking, I think the ECB will be looking closely at the experience of the People's Bank of China at implementing a digital yuan. I think a few things. I do think the digital euro. I mean, it's China is like an interesting canvas and like a frame. I think that's why a lot of people ask me about it, because so many things that I give as examples and stories can be seen as dystopian, but then people are also like, well, this will never happen for me in Europe or in the United States or the United Kingdom. And I'm going to share with you a couple of stories of the digital yuan, and or payments in China that I think freak me out personally, and leave it to kind of. And I'll try to make the link to see that even if you have, obviously, Europe still a democracy, right? The European Commission, the European Parliament. We just had the European parliamentary elections, so I can't say directly apples to apples here. But I will say that when it comes to these technocratic implementations, the ECB will learn and implement things that can have similar effects. So it can happen. We have to be on our guard across the world with these particular implementations. And specifically in these like kind of more niche financial and economic matters, where I think the Europeans and other democracies will probably copy and learn more from China than they would like to admit. But two stories in China that always give me a little bit pause for concern. One is with the not actually related to the digital yuan per se. Actually, no, we'll go with one with the digital yuan. The when the pilots were unleashed in China, one of the interesting things that was a little bit understudied was that China's central bank directly issued the CBDC. So that is the main difference between the CBDC and deposits in the commercial banking system, right? We're talking about the difference between
Hmm.
base money and bond money. In the case of a central bank directly getting involved, it's base money, and this has implications that people don't, I think, understand very well. And we're going to see this live in China. In China, what they chose to do, I think, because it's a smaller portion of the Chinese monetary supply, and they were able to kind of like just justify doing this, is they were able to create these direct liabilities to the central bank. So they kind of airdrop digital yuan. They like airdropped it. So they basically texted random people in different cities working with the local governments and said like, hey, if you want your free digital yuan, you have to download this app, you have to claim it, etc. But one thing they did was they made the money expirable. So not only was it like kind of individualized, but they actually also made it possible to expire the funds. I think this is really interesting because even when you look at the American and the European debate, one of the reasons, at least I've seen a lot of American scholars write about this for the implementation of CBDC, is that you can offer individualized interest rates. And that's the big thing that the BIS is talking about as well. But the thing with individualized interest rates, right now, central banks sends a policy interest rate, right? And then the banking system acts
Hmm.
as an intermediary. But when you're looking at the level of an individual, the central bank really wants to dictate economic behavior. That is its job. And it will seek to punish and reward on a level that we may deem to be non criminal or actually ethical. So, for example, imagine a situation, you don't have to because the ECB actually had negative interest rates as a policy rate, right? And the whole idea was that, like, we need to get all these reserves and we need to get money out into the economy. So it's not far fetched to say, for example, that a central bank will penalize individual savers because that is the entire point of the exercise. And in China, they basically did that because they said you need to spend this money or else it will expire. Like, you can
But
imagine in a European or
you
American
got it for
implementation,
free? You mean when they issued it, people got it for free?
people
The
got it for
digital
free.
yuan?
Yeah, people got it for
Okay,
free.
and why is it only a small percentage of the monetary transaction today? Why don't everybody use the digital yuan?
Well, so that's part of the thing. I think the Europeans will try to learn from this as well. As it turns out, central banks are not very good at being tech companies, basically, right? So in China, the Chinese payments ecosystem is dominated by WeChat Pay and Alipay. That's 94% of the domestic payments processing. Now, the digital yuan, the thing that's worrying about the digital yuan is that when the government fails, it tends to use of force, right? And so the digital yuan has failed in terms of adoption, but they keep on trying harder and harder and harder to get that to go, to get the adoption curve up. And what I mean by that is like, they give it for free. They put like expiry conditions on it. They forced integrated into the largest merchants and banks because obviously they regulate all the banks.
Hmm.
They made it so that government employees are paid in ECNY. They made it so that government services such as public transit need payment in ECNY. They implemented ECNY as one of only three payment options available during the Winter Olympics, right? So all these different things, but that doesn't mean it's going to be popular because, for example, you had like the South Central Morning Post come back to Suzhou, and people were just like, I mean, this is another app, and it's not that useful for me. So China, one thing that they did was kind of interesting is they made the digital yuan 0% merchant transaction fee. So they tried to basically make a public option for merchant adoption, but it didn't actually work that well because there's like about I think 10x less merchants on the digital yuan than there are on Alipay and WeChat Pay. And Alipay and WeChat Pay have very strong network economies. So you'll use WeChat Pay because you are on WeChat, and that's kind of like your everything app, right?
Hmm.
Um, So you will actually not download another app because it's pointless. And I think that's one thing CBDCs, that's one reason why I think CBDCs, like, for example, Nigeria, it's just not very popular. People get the sense that it's privacy invading. So even though China has said, like, hey, like, we're not going to surveil things, and there's privacy tiers, even the lowest privacy tier that China uses, you have to put down your phone number. I believe in Europe, it's the same thing as in China. You have to register your SIM with your real ID. So, I
Mm,
mean, in essence, they know everybody's identity who's using the system, right? Whether or not they choose to use that is a different question. But with cash, they could not, right? They could not associate your real ID with your transactions, or not in a way that's like manageable. But with a digital
mm.
currency, they can. I think these are things that the European Union, the ECB, will learn from China and probably implement.
Okay, and what do you think in the US there is a resistance to CBDC? Like, what makes the US so different from Europe and China?
Well, I don't know that. I will say one thing about what makes the U.S. different from China, at least, which is that China there is no like checks and balances, right? If China wants to
Mm,
release, a central bank digital currency, they were the first government to really do it because the central bank reports to the Chinese state, right? This is like a fact that's very different about the Chinese system. I think in the US and UK, I'm not as actually aware of the EU, but I assume there is some kind of democratic mechanism involved. I mean, ultimately, the European Commission stems from the European Parliament members, so people will be able
mm,
to
mm,
vote. I know there are members of the European Parliament, I think Patrick Breyer, for example, who have been very strong on the European Commission's moves to, on end to end encryption, on chat control, and things like that. So I imagine there will be some kind of voices talking about central bank digital currency if it were to be implemented. I think in the U.S., they voted in Congress. I do think in the states it's become like kind of a political issue. It's been kind of really interesting. I don't think this has happened as much in Europe. But in the United States, what you've seen is it's almost become like party based. Like the Republican Party has put in its platform that it will not allow CBDC. Like Donald Trump also tweeted about that.
mm,
I think JD Vance as well, his recent vice presidential pick. Um, I don't know. I think part of it, I mean, I'll give you like my frank answer about that is like part of it is I think like the American infrastructure for Bitcoin, because the Bitcoin miners came in and like there's actually like a really strong lobbying group for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies writ large. And so one thing I think that has happened, you've seen these like tons of political contributions. You've seen that Trump is going to speak at Bitcoin Nashville. Remember, politicians will
mm,
only do these things if there's an interest for them. And in this case, it's contributions, votes, and support. I do think the United States has like a really significant like crypto and Bitcoin kind of, I don't know how that will translate to actual votes, but I think politicians believe that, this will have a lot of impact on their our voting line. So, you see Trump coming up against CBDCs. And so that's become kind of like a party line issue now. But even very early on, the first skeptics of CBDCs. Another factor I think actually plays into U.S. China a little bit. A lot of the set of the congressional people that were strongest on CBDCs, for example, Senator Johnson, were also strongest in the U.S. China rhetoric. I think in Europe, it's a little bit more mixed. The vis-a-vis like how China and Europe kind of interact with one another, right? I don't think it's as polarized as the U.S. and China are, and so I think that has helped the U.S. be very strongly against CBDCs, or at least parts of, or at least now almost the entire Republican Party, because they oftentimes bring up this argument, like Senator Johnson did, where they're like, China did this thing, so we should not do it. It's against liberty, it's against freedom, it's against privacy, and all these different things. Um, I think it's kind of more a nuance in that, but they generally have the spirit right. They generally have the CBDCs being privacy invading and not allowing people to circulate money. But I could see the conversation having more heat in the United States rather than Europe because of these factors. One of the things that's interesting about Europe, actually, a little bit of an aside, is like how aggressive Alipay has gotten on the continent. Actually, that's one thing I've been also starting to track as well. A few people have mentioned it to me as kind of like a conduit. I don't think Alipay would be as aggressive from a PR perspective in the United States for exactly these reasons.
Okay, interesting. It's going to be a fascinating future, evolving grounds, basically, where we see Bitcoin fighting or resisting censorship and competing with CBDCs and Alipay and the likes. So very exciting times we live in. We have to wrap it up, unfortunately. Thanks a lot for sharing your insights with us, and hope to get you soon for another episode on the show.
Yeah, Judd, thanks a lot for having me, and hopefully there's some insight that's valuable. I would just, came up with the book Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, but anybody who wants to study more about Chinese economics history, I think it has a ton of relevancy to Bitcoin investment and just your overall view on world economics and world politics.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Have a good one.